Amid a dim outlook for the global economy and an accelerating transition from unipolar to multipolar in the political arena, Europe finds itself caught between two competing pressures. On the one hand, there's increasing pressure from the US to decouple from China, and on the other hand, the push for strategic autonomy and resistance to becoming America's followers are getting strong. Under such circumstances, is supply chain diversification really necessary for European multinationals? How does Europe position itself in the China-US competition? Today, I'm excited to be joined by Mr. Wuttke, President of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China and Vice President of BASF China. Let's dive into the interview and hear his insights and perspectives regarding these questions. Mr. Wuttke, thanks for joining us in the show.
Thank you for inviting us.
Mr. Wuttke, you've lived and worked in China for over 30 years, and you witnessed the radical changes that Chinese society has gone through over the past 3 decades. Which aspect of China's economy has impressed you the most in the past?
Well, I arrived for the first time in China in 1982. Virtually everybody was wearing blue things and green things, and it was inconceivable that people will have as many cars that we have now. I have been privileged to be at the largest and biggest economic comeback story in human history. And I must say, of course, I never saw this coming. I mean, I had great faith in China's economic development, but there was no way I could have imagined that we have as many cars in China and as many high-rises as there are now. So in essence, I would say if there's one common thread is I constantly have underestimated China's abilities, but I was lucky to have been proven wrong time and again.
Nowadays, the Chinese economy is deeply embedded in the world economy. And some experts even say decoupling with China might be self-destructive for some countries. Is the European leadership inclined to decouple from China?
Well, decoupling would be destructive for everybody. If whatever you connect with, if you decouple, you lose something. It would be a loss for America, for Europe, Japan, but certainly also a huge loss for China. In a way, we all benefited from globalization, but we see politics seeping in order to actually cause concerns that we have stable supply chains. So in essence, I completely understand when the European Commission, in particular President von der Leyen, who I met about 2 weeks ago, was stressing de-risking, meaning that we should engage, we should have investment going both ways and trade. At the same time, we should possibly look into areas where we might be vulnerable or dependent on China. And China has been showcasing this themselves. They have been pretty much going for de-risking for a couple of years already, trying to be less dependent on a couple of items, particularly on the information communication technology. So in a way, I think it is totally naive to believe that total openness will prevail. I'm worried about decoupling. So if we find a way how to have a de-risking, meaning a small area where we try to be less dependent on foreign sources, then I think China and Europe can do quite well.
As the senior executives in the multinational corporation, in your opinion, is supply chain diversification really necessary for multinationals?
Not at this stage, I think, but clearly it is in the cards. I mean, if you just look at China's strategy in the information communication technology, how they have basically relied to 95% on Chinese equipment on the 5G network, that is something we call de-risking. So in a way, I can understand that some areas you want to be less dependent and less vulnerable towards your trading partner. But again, we have to watch out because in essence, that means you will have less choice, higher prices, and you might end up not being in a better position. I think that multinationals that operate in China now are trying to see where they're vulnerable. They try to see where politics comes engaged from the Chinese side or also from the American side. I don't see any major impact from the European interlocutors or regulators. So in a way, it is something where we Europeans very often find ourselves in an odd location. For example, Chinese customers telling us not to come up with machinery with American components, American softwares, and American customers telling our machine companies that they should come up with solutions without Chinese components and Chinese softwares. So in a way, that leaves Europeans always in a very odd location.
The EU and China are each other's largest trading partners as of 2023, and the bilateral relationships between the two countries stay mutually beneficial for many years. But there has been a growing debate in the European Union in recent years about how to deal with an increasingly powerful China. What are the major concerns behind such a debate?
Well, the debate goes in the direction, how much do we depend on China? Are we dependent too much on China? And I was recently in Brussels and Berlin trying to showcase that we are not really dependent on China. We actually too little dependent on China. You mentioned the great trade going on between Europe and China. Again, if you look in 2022, we have a solid 6.4 million containers going from east to west, from China into the European Union. European community as well as consumers, they love Chinese products. And how do we fare? Well, European companies just ship about 1.6 million containers to China. So 6.4 going west, 1.6 going east. In a way that just showcases that we have a problem with market access. So in a way, I tell them, we are not dependent on China enough. In a way, the same is with investment. We do $8 to $9 billion investment every year in Europe, in China. European companies putting this money on the ground, mostly in greenfield. China, in essence, pre-COVID, was doing 13, 14, 15 billion dollars in European Union, meaning China for many years invested more in Europe than European companies invested in China. It doesn't normally ring a bell, and I think it's very good that Chinese companies invest in Europe as much as we do. But if you look into the magnitude of things, in essence, every year we invest in Texas as much as we invest in China. How is this possible? In short, we are underinvested in China. And again, I think it's all these market access problems. And if you look into our exports, we just last year exported 23% more into China than into Switzerland. That, of course, shows the imbalance. So I try to rebuke our interlocutors in Europe. I'm not saying we are too dependent on China. We're actually too little dependent on China. We want to be more interdependent.
In April, both French President Emmanuel Macron and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visited China on the same day. How have their visits impacted the trade ties between China and Europe? And do you think the mutual engagement and the understanding are back on track now?
No, they're not back on track. I mean, after 3 years COVID, you can't expect anything to go back on track in one day or one visit. It's a small and gradual process. I think the visit of the French president was very good. He brought more business for France. He certainly brought more business for China as well. There's more investment going on, in particular for Airbus, bringing together air parts in Tianjin. There will be an assembly line added to the existing assembly line. But must also say that it's not just business, it's an economy which benefits. President Macron was very smart about adding a very famous French musician who happens to be married to Gong Li, a famous Chinese film star, and he brought with him Claude Lanzmann, who is a very important filmmaker in France. We have to do more on arts. We have to do more in this empathy business of human-to-human contact in order to understand each other. Von der Leyen's business was certainly more of technocratic background. She listened carefully about market access issues. Again, she emphasized rightfully de-risking for Europe and also the areas where we need improvement. She took away my position paper with 430 pages, certainly not something you put easily in your handbag. And I was very grateful for her of raising these issues.
It's said the European leaders are becoming increasingly favorable toward French President Macron's push for strategic autonomy. What's your opinion in terms of Europe's strategic autonomy? Do you believe Europeans should think twice before following Americans' moves?
Well, we should not forget that America is an ally. In particular, in my case, the American soldiers, among others, including the Russians, liberated us from masses, and we don't forget this kind of things. Again, we sell 6 times more into the American economy. We invest in America in 1 year what we have invested in China in 20 years. So in the magnitude of things, there is a strong interlinkage with our ally United States. There's nothing where we can sort of stay, we stay in the middle. There's no middle ground for us. But doesn't mean we have to be a vassal. Doesn't mean that we have to be dependent on the White House. Certainly not. And I think people tend to forget we had a trade war with the Trump administration. We couldn't export cars, so we still have these downsides. We have a massive disagreement on the IRA, this American scheme in order to lure European investment in the new energy vehicles, for example, to the United States. And again, China could be so much closer to the European Union if they would permit us to do more with the economy over here. Again, I think it is up to China in order to open up more so that we can invest more in China than we do in Texas.
How do you see the future of the China-Europe relationship in the coming years? What steps can be taken to ensure it remains strong and productive?
Well, that's the hardest question, to look into the future when you can hardly understand what happened in the past. I mean, I could never, ever anticipate that there will be this kind of tension between the US and China and the kind of impact it has on us. Again, you have a black swan event like the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which has derailed so many of our projects together. Belt and Road, the train transport from China into Europe has been mightily impacted. The kind of flight times has been extended a lot. This kind of Russia war has caused so much damage to our relationships. And again, it's very important to see that we maintain this, understand each other, that we actually listen to the other party where the issues are. So anyway, where do we head? I don't know. I think in some areas, particularly when you look at US-China relationship, that has an impact on us. I hope we can de-escalate, can find a floor and doesn't get worse. And then, of course, for us, there's one overriding issue is we maintain speed, commitment, and work on the climate change. I think that's very important. The climate is not waiting for our geopolitical issues to be sorted out. And I think there's good engagement going on. China has been incredibly engaging and actually has been determining the positive outcome of the Biodiversity Summit in Montreal last year. Again, a topic where we can't wait. If we wait too long, we have not the nature that our children deserve. So in essence, we have to work on the areas where we find common ground and common necessity. And for the others, we just have to lay low and just sort of see that we don't overreact and de-escalate in language as well as in actions.